Hi guys! So today you are going to be starting to learn about the second special defence that is available against a murder charge, which is loss of control. So we have the topic outcomes for this topic on the screen, which are as follows. Now, you've already had a look at one of the special defences, murder, which is diminished responsibility, and finished that content. So now we're going to move on to the second one. In particular, for this lesson, what you need to be able to do by the end is partially achieve this aim. So we're going to start looking at the actus reus elements of loss of control. And by the end, you should be able to explain what a total loss of self-control is, which is the first actus reus element. Why do you need to be able to do that? Well, that's so in the exam you can apply your knowledge to a scenario question and also evaluate the law. So yesterday you started having a little look at the old defence of provocation and what used to be around before the Coroners and Justice Act reformed the law and created the new defence of loss of self-control. Now, while the cases in provocation are not classed as good law because that defence has been abolished and it can no longer be raised, you still need to understand what provocation was as a defence to see how the law has developed and whether the law is clearer and fairer now with the new defence. And it also helps you understand the actus reus elements in a little bit more detail. So I just want to make it very clear that the cases of Walia and Thornton and provocation itself, you will not include that in an AO2 scenario question, as a lot of students start off loss of self-control talking about provocation when that is no longer the law. However, like I said, it's really important for evaluation purposes, so you do still need to understand these cases and how the law is developed. So you had a little look at the case of Walia and answered these questions. Now, this was a really tragic case and it attracted a lot of media attention on appeal. So there's actually been a film created about Walia, and it's called Provoked. So I did have on the slide the front cover of the DVD there. It is available on Amazon Prime, and if you can watch it, I would recommend watching it. It's a real harrowing story, and it's a very sad and brutal film to watch. However, it does give you a great insight into her story and the law at the time. However, if you haven't got the chance to watch that, that's absolutely fine. You're not going to be at a disadvantage because, like I said, you won't be discussing this case in great depth in a scenario question. But just to talk you through what happened. So Walia had an arranged marriage and she'd married her husband quite young. It was a very abusive relationship, especially towards the end, and she would be beaten. Now, Walia had a young son, and not only was she sort of fearing for her life, she was also fearing for her son's. So one night, in an argument, her husband had threatened to beat her with an iron, and he threatened that he was going to beat her the next day. After years and years of abuse, okay, Walia was very damaged and hurt. And what she did was, she thought, I need to get out of this house, I need to escape. However, she was concerned that if she packed her bags and tried to escape, her husband would follow her and her son, and then the consequences would be a lot worse. So she planned to set fire to his feet when he went to bed that night. Now, she says this was simply to help her escape, and she claimed that she wanted to leave scars on his feet and blisters so that when he walked after the accident, he would feel just a fraction of the pain of what he put her through with the years of the abusive marriage. However, that went wrong. Walia poured petrol over her husband's feet while he was asleep that night, set fire to his feet, and obviously the flames engulfed his body, and he died from his injuries. So while she admitted she wanted to set fire to his feet, she was disputing that she wanted to actually kill him. Okay? But she was charged with murder, and she raised the defense of provocation, which was available at the time. Now, this defense failed, and it failed on the grounds that the loss of control wasn't sudden. Okay? She had planned to set fire to his feet, and she waited until he went to bed that night to do it. So essentially, what she had was a cooling down period. Now, if we just flip to our, I can't move this along. Right, it's cut off a little bit of the point here, but you can see the last box on the bottom, and you've got this key terminology on your PowerPoint. And the cooling down period is basically a time lapse between the last act of provocation and the killing of the victim. So the last time that her husband provoked her by threatening to hit her over the head with the iron and threatening to beat her so hard the next day, and then the time until she had lost control. Now, the longer the time lapse, the weaker the evidence of loss of control, and the more it suggests it is a revenge killing. It is planned, it is premeditated. The defendant hasn't just lost it in that second, they've thought about the consequences, and they have still gone ahead with the killing. So on that evidence and on that basis, the defense of provocation failed. You've also got another case in your handout where a lady tried to raise this defense after she killed her violent and abusive husband, and that's Thornton. Similarly, the victim, well, Thornton was actually the defendant in this case, but she was a victim of domestic abuse. She had a very violent relationship. Her husband was an abusive alcoholic. And one day they'd been arguing, and he'd basically told her to pack her bags, get out the house. She'd later returned where he was asleep on the sofa, and she was trying to reconcile. So she wanted to make up with her husband and get back to normal. Now, he'd threatened her, swore at her, again said, go away, get out the house, and he went back to sleep. Now, she then went into the kitchen, took a knife from the drawer, sharpened the knife, and went back into the living room to try and reconcile again. At this point, he'd made further abusive comments, and so she stabbed him in the stomach. Again, Thornton was claiming that she had been provoked into the killing, okay, and the defense failed. Again, there was a cooling off period. From the last time her husband had provoked her, woke up, shouted at her, she'd then gone into the kitchen, sharpened the knife, and then went back into the living room before killing him. This planning and premeditation of the killing, the sharpening of the knife, was proof that it wasn't a provoked attack, and it was more, again, a revenge killing. But these decisions can't be completely fair, because we've got these women who've suffered years and years of abuse, who are fearing for their lives, okay? Yet they are left with no defense. Remember, diminished responsibility at this point didn't take into account all physical conditions. And things like battered spousal syndrome and coercive control, they were not recognised medical conditions at the time. And the defence of provocation wouldn't work here. It was actually seen as a man's defence, a jealous man's defence, because at the time it was raised by a lot of men who had found out that their wives had been cheating, and in that moment they'd been provoked, they'd lost their self-control and they'd killed them. And the government didn't want this, okay? They didn't essentially just want a defence that was available for jealous men who killed their wives and didn't provide any redress for women who had suffered very violent, abusive relationships and also essentially been provoked. Because of the cooling down period and the time lapse, it couldn't work. So those were the main issues with the law on provocation, which you should have filled in on page 14 of your handout. There was no defence for a slow burn reaction. The loss of control had to be sudden. It had to be there and then. So if at the point when Walia's husband had turned round and said, I'm going to pick that iron up off the side, batter you over the head with that, tomorrow you're going to get the worst beating of your life. At that moment in time, and he was shouting at her, and when she was fearful, if she had been the one to pick up the iron and batter him over the head and killed him in that moment in time, that would have been a sudden loss of control. There would have been no time lapse between the last act of provocation, and then it would have been a different story. The defence could have been successful. And the other main issue is that any evidence of planning and premeditation also prevents the defence from succeeding. So again, in Thornton, if her husband hadn't been asleep on the settee, let's say the argument had taken place in the kitchen and her husband was screaming at her to get out, in her bed, threatening her, and at that moment in time, she turned around and there was a knife on the side. She picked that up and stabbed him in the stomach there and then. That would have been a sudden loss of control. And again, a very different story for Thornton. So, we're now going to have a little look at the AO1 of loss of control. Okay, so this is the new law, the new defence that comes from section 54 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. And this is the AO1 that you will describe in the exam. So this begins at the bottom of page 14 and runs on to page 15 and 16. And the full definition is in the blue box at the top here. And it tells us that this is a defence, okay, if these acts or omissions in doing the killing resulted from. So this first line here is just telling us that there is a defence available if all of these elements are satisfied. So that first line, you don't need to write that in the exam. Your AO1 starts here. Okay, it's everything in blue, and then this purple line is an extra part to consider. So the first thing that the jury need to be satisfied on, the first thing that the defence need to prove, okay, for defence, so on the balance of probabilities, is that the defendant lost self-control, okay? So I've written that below as the first point, and that's the first thing that in a scenario question you need to describe, and then you need to decide using the facts from the scenario. And we're going to look at this actus reus element in detail today. Now, this loss of self-control has to come from something called a qualifying trigger. Okay, so this is the second thing. that you need to describe and then decide. First of all, has the defendant lost their self-control? Second of all, did they lose their self-control because of a qualifying trigger? Now, these qualifying triggers are found in Section 55 of the Commonwealth and Justice Act 2009. Okay? And then the statute goes on to talk about the final element. Okay? Now, before we move on to that, I want to talk about these qualifying triggers a little bit. We will be looking at these qualifying triggers in further detail tomorrow. But for now, we're just going to look at what they are. So, a qualifying trigger can either be a fear of serious violence from the victim, okay? And we're calling this person the victim because even though they might be the person who is provoking the defendant, they are the one that is ended up dead, and the defendant is the one that's killed them. Now, this is quite an important part as well. It can be against D or another identified person. So the defendant doesn't actually need to be the one fearing serious violence. Okay? That's quite a straightforward qualifying trigger. Okay? Does the defendant fear that the victim is going to inflict some serious harm on them? Okay? Are they threatening to, I don't know, beat them to a pulp, stab them, or do something in that moment in time? Are they threatening to stab their best friend, brother, partner, mother? Because remember, it could also be another identified person. And that's easy to pick up in a scenario, okay? If you've got, I don't know, men having a fight, they've been out drinking together, and the victim turns around and says, you know, I'm going to beat you to a pulp now, picks up a hammer and is edging towards the defendant. If they fear serious violence at that moment in time, then that can be a qualifying trigger. That can lead to them losing self-control. Okay? The second one is a little bit more tricky. And it can be something that was done or said. So it can be actions or it can be words. Okay? That did two things. Okay? First of all, it constituted circumstances of an extremely grave character and then caused the defendant to have a justified sense of being seriously wronged. So what that means is the victim has either carried out acts or said words, okay, which were extremely grave, of extremely grave character. So they've said something very, very bad here. It can't just be, I don't know, calling new trainers that they've got on or calling them because they're wearing glasses. They need to have said something extremely grave. So let's say, for example, they are mocking the dead, or perhaps threatening or mocking to sexually assault or rape. Okay, it's got to be something of an extremely grave character, and we will look at these AO1 points in a lot more detail when we come on to them. And then the second point is that it caused the defendant to have a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. Okay. And then the last AO1 point that you need to deal with, which is in the statute here, and obviously number 3 at the bottom, is that a person of the same sex and age with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint, and in the circumstances of D, might have reacted in the same or similar way. Okay, so what it's asking here is, it's asking the jury to compare that defendant with someone in their shoes. So it's got to be someone with a similar age, same sex, and it's got here a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint. So let's just say that's the reasonable man. And in the circumstances of the defendant, so the jury need to put themselves in the defendant's shoes. Would they have acted in the same or similar way? Now, this question isn't asking if the jury would have killed in that situation, because that's a really difficult question. If you asked a member of the jury who was sitting quite calmly, okay, you know, if you were in Dave's position, would you have killed James? That's not something that somebody will easily admit, or not even admit, but think they're capable of, because the reasonable man would say that they could never commit a murder. So they're not asking the jury, would you have committed murder? But they're asking basically, would you have lost your control in that situation? Okay. All of these A1 points we're going to discuss in detail in later lessons. So if you are sitting there a little bit confused, please don't worry. We will come on to them. The first thing that we need to look at is, has the defendant lost self-control? Now, this little bit of guidance on the bottom of the statute, which I've highlighted in purple, gives us a little bit of guidance here and says that the loss of control doesn't have to be sudden any longer. Why? Well, because loss of control is trying to fix the issues with provocation. It's trying to provide a defence where there might have been a little bit of a cooling off period. It's not about that. It's not all about time. It's about whether the defendant in that moment in time has completely lost it. Okay. And if there's been a time lapse of 5 minutes, half an hour, is that to say that the defendant hasn't completely lost it? You know, it was very unfair to have that as a restriction. So it's removed that. So a little bit more guidance on, I'm trying to move this box. Right, unfortunately the recording has cut off part of the box, but you will have this PowerPoint available, so you'll be able to read the sentences in full when you go onto that. So in this column is some guidance on what loss of control needs to be or what it doesn't need to be. And then in this column are some questions that I want you to answer. Okay, and they're very focused on sort of an AO3 stance. So we now know that the loss of control no longer has to be sudden. Now, there isn't an exact time scale. Okay. Though, the longer the time period, the time lapse between the last act of provocation and the loss of control, I would say the weaker the defence. So while the statute is now saying, you know, the defendant doesn't have to lose it right there and right then, as soon as those words leave the victim's mouth, they don't need to pick up a knife or pick up a hammer and smack them in the head or stab them right in that second. It's saying it no longer has to be sudden. So for someone to lose control, they still do need to be reacting to what the victim is doing there and then. So the longer they take to react, I would say the weaker the defense. Okay. So it is trying to redress the issue within provocation. And then you have your question there. How might a loss of control, no longer having to be sudden and temporary, support women who try and claim the defense of loss of control? Okay. So thinking back to how in provocation the act needed to be sudden, how's that changed? How can that help women? Now, this is a question for the jury to decide. Okay, it will be put to the jury. Has the defendant lost control? Now, there's no statutory or judicial interpretation of the meaning. Okay, the jury are going to be expected to draw upon their life experiences and think about what that means to them. So there has been a little bit of support and guidance. So on page 14, you have a question. What have the judges interpreted loss of self-control to also mean? And I've got a few quotes for you. So judges have found loss of control to mean losing their ability to maintain their action in accordance with considered judgment. Okay. The second quote is D lost normal powers of reasoning. Okay. And then also that the defendant saw a red mist. So when you're thinking about whether the defendant has lost self-control, at that moment in time, the questions that you need to ask yourself are they thinking straight? Okay, are they thinking logically? Are they thinking about the consequences of smacking a hammer over someone's head? Or have they just lost it? Have they just saw a red mist and snapped? Okay. Have they lost all normal powers of reasoning? So they're not standing with a knife thinking, shall I stab my husband? I could go to jail, but he's been abusing me for years and I am quite fearful. Going back and forth with themselves. They've just lost it in that moment. They're not thinking of the consequences. They're not thinking logically that they could kill their husband. They've saw a red mist and their judgment is totally gone. Okay. Now we have got a case to help with this, and it demonstrates the restrictions here. So it's quite a new case, quite a recent case. It's from 2014, and it's the case of R.V. Jewell. So in this case, the defendant had shot B with a shotgun and then fled the scene in his car. Now, on trial, he told the jury that he had suddenly lost control because the victim, had been threatening him. However, when he was arrested and his car was searched, the police had found clothes, a tent, a passport, a checkbook, and he'd even asked his neighbour to look after his cat. So, if someone is in a car with a shotgun, okay, driving away from a murder scene, with a suitcase full of clothes, a tent, their passport and a checkbook, and they've made arrangements for their pet to be looked after, does that suggest that on the way to see the victim, the defendant just completely snapped, lost all powers of normal reasoning, wasn't thinking about the consequences? Or does it suggest more of a planned, premeditated attack? If you've got your passport in the car and a checkbook and you've packed up your house, you know you're fleeing the scene of a murder. And if you want to get out of the country, you're going to try and do that. So, again, any evidence of planning and premeditation would mean that the defense would fail. So that's something that's followed over from provocation. Okay. And the restrictions are that it has to be a total loss of control, and temper and anger are insufficient and not allowed. So someone just losing their temper, someone just acting out of character, that's not going to be enough. In that moment in time, they need to have totally lost it. Now, you've got the case of duel, which is talking about planning and premeditation. That might not always be evident in a scenario. So you might get a scenario question where you have a couple arguing and then one of them kills the other. Now, it might not say they've packed a bag, they went and sharpened the knife, or anything like that. So you have no evidence of planning and premeditation. So that means the defense could work. However, how do you decide if they completely lost self-control? Well, the questions you need to ask yourself are what I've just discussed. At that moment in time, did the defendant stab the victim without thinking, without any logic? Do you think they've totally lost self-control by what the victim has been saying or what they have done? Or are they fearing serious violence and therefore they've lost their self-control? Remember, it doesn't have to be sudden. Okay? However, the longer the time lapse, the less likely it is they're going to succeed. So we're going to leave it there for today. We've discussed the first AO1 element, which is that the defendant needs to have totally lost self-control. Tomorrow, we will move on to looking at qualifying triggers in more detail. I hope that's clear. If there are any questions or any queries, please just drop me an email. Thank you.